The courtroom was quiet except for the hum of the overhead lights and the occasional rustle of papers. It was one of those ordinary mornings in a municipal courthouse. Fluorescent lighting, scuffed linoleum floors, and rows of hard wooden benches filled with people waiting for their turn in front of the judge. Most were there for small claims, housing disputes, or minor traffic violations. No cameras, no reporters, just everyday life grinding through the legal system. At the front of the room, standing alone at the defendant's table, was a woman in her early 30s. She wore a clean but slightly wrinkled blouse and dark slacks, the kind of outfit someone puts on after a long night shift. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and though her eyes were tired, they held a steady focus. She clutched a manila folder tightly in both hands, its edges worn from being opened and closed too many times. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't have a team behind her or a fancy briefcase full of legal documents prepared by professionals. She was there by herself, just a single mother who'd spent the last 6 months trying to keep a roof over her child's head while fighting a landlord who claimed she owed thousands in back rent she didn't actually owe. The judge entered, robes flowing, expression unreadable. He took his seat with a quiet thud and glanced at the docket. When he saw her case, his eyes flicked up, then down again as if already making up his mind. He'd seen plenty like her before. People without representation, people who didn't know the right words to say or the right forms to file. In his view, they wasted the court's time with messy stories and emotional pleas. "Next case," he said, voice flat. She stepped forward, heart pounding. She'd practiced what to say 100 times in front of her bathroom mirror, whispering so her child wouldn't wake up. She'd read every tenant rights pamphlet the city offered, watched online tutorials about courtroom procedure, and even sat in on other hearings just to understand how things worked. "Your Honor," she began, voice softer than she intended, "I'm here representing myself. I've filed all the documents the court asked for, and I'd like to present my evidence." The judge barely looked up. "You understand this is a legal proceeding, not a storytelling hour, correct?" A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The bailiff glanced at the ceiling. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady, "but the facts are on my side. I have receipts, bank statements, and a copy of the lease agreement that shows—" "Receipts?" The judge interrupted, a hint of amusement in his tone. "This isn't a garage sale, ma'am. We deal in law here, not grocery lists." A couple of clerks exchanged glances. The woman felt her cheeks burn, but she didn't look away. She'd been talked down to before, by landlords, by caseworkers, by strangers who assumed she was irresponsible just because she was raising a child alone. But this was different. This was her last chance. She took a slow breath. "With respect, Your Honor, the receipts prove I paid rent on time every month. The issue is that the landlord changed management companies mid-lease and never updated the records. I've been trying to resolve this for months, but they kept sending me bills for the same period over and over." The judge sighed, as if bored. "And you expect the court to sort out your landlord's bookkeeping problems?" "No, Your Honor," she said firmly. "I expect the court to look at the evidence I've submitted, which shows I fulfilled my obligations under the lease. The law protects tenants from being charged twice for the same period. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for fairness." For a moment, there was silence. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. Then the judge leaned back, folding his arms. "Let me get this straight. You're not a lawyer. You've never been to law school. But you're standing here telling me how the law works?" "I'm telling you what the documents show," she corrected gently. "And I've cited the relevant city housing code sections in my filing. Section 1245, subsection B, specifically addresses duplicate billing after a management transfer." The judge blinked. He hadn't expected that. Most self-represented litigants stumbled over basic terms like plaintiff and defendant. Few could quote a municipal code by number. He glanced at the file in front of him, flipping through it more carefully now. Sure enough, near the back, there was a neatly printed excerpt from the local housing ordinance highlighted in yellow. Below it, a timeline of payments cross-referenced with bank records and dated emails. He cleared his throat. "Where did you get this information?" "I read it," she said simply. "I spent nights at the public library. I called the tenant hotline. I asked questions until I understood." The judge hesitated. His usual script, dismiss, admonish, move on, wasn't working. This woman wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She wasn't making excuses. She was just prepared. Across the room, the landlord's representative, A man in a cheap suit who'd barely paid attention until now suddenly sat up straighter. He hadn't expected any real pushback. The judge rubbed his temple. "All right," he said, voice less sharp now. "Present your evidence, but keep it concise." She nodded, opened her folder, and began to walk through each document, explaining dates, amounts, and discrepancies with calm precision. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She just laid out the truth piece by piece like someone assembling a puzzle everyone else had given up on. As she spoke, something shifted in the room. The bailiff stopped fidgeting. The clerk started taking notes. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the paper she placed on the bench. When she finished, she stepped back. "That's all I have, Your Honor. Thank you for your time." The judge didn't respond right away. He stared at the stack of documents, then at her. For the first time that morning, he looked uncertain. "Counsel for the plaintiff," he said, turning to the landlord's rep. "Do you have any response to this?" The man stammered something about internal errors and miscommunication, but it was clear he hadn't reviewed the case closely. He'd assumed it would be an easy win against someone without a lawyer. The judge exhaled slowly. "We'll take a 10-minute recess." As the gavel tapped and people began to murmur, the woman returned to her seat. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of holding it together for so long. Outside, the world kept turning. But inside that courtroom, something rare had happened. Someone who was supposed to be invisible had made herself impossible to ignore. And the judge? He walked back to his chambers with a new question in his mind, one he hadn't asked himself in years. What if I've been wrong about people like her? The 10-minute recess felt like an eternity. She sat on the hard wooden bench, eyes fixed on the floor, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her mind raced, not with fear, but with the quiet hum of preparation meeting reality. She'd rehearsed this moment so many times, in the kitchen while washing dishes on the bus during her commute, late at night after tucking her child into bed. Every possible question, every objection, every twist she could imagine. But no amount of practice could prepare her for the look on the judge's face when she quoted that housing code section. It wasn't anger. It was surprise. And maybe, just maybe, the first crack in a wall she'd been trying to scale for months. Across the aisle, the landlord's representative paced near the water fountain, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and urgent. He hadn't expected to actually defend anything. Most tenants in her situation either didn't show up or broke down crying halfway through. This calm, organized, citation-ready woman wasn't in his playbook. When the bailiff called the court back to order, the air felt different, tighter, charged with something unspoken. The judge re-entered, slower this time, his expression unreadable. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at her. "Before we proceed," he said, voice measured, "I'd like to clarify something. You mentioned you're not an attorney. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, standing again. "I'm representing myself. And yet you referenced a specific municipal code section, 1245 subsection B, with accuracy. How did you come to know that?" She didn't hesitate. "I read the city's tenant rights handbook cover to cover. Then I went to the public library and looked up the full municipal code online. I also reviewed 3 recent housing court decisions that cited that same section. One was from last year, involving a nearly identical situation. Duplicate billing after a property management change." A murmur rippled through the small gallery. Even the court reporter glanced up. The judge leaned forward slightly. "You studied case law?" "I had to," she said simply. "If I was going to stand in front of you and ask for justice, I owed it to myself and to my child to understand what the law actually says, not just what people tell me it says." The judge was silent for a long moment. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "Proceed with your argument." She took a breath and stepped forward again. This time she didn't just present receipts. She walked the court through a timeline, month by month, showing payments made, confirmation emails received, and the exact date the management company changed hands. She pointed out that the new company had sent her a welcome letter acknowledging receipt of her file, yet still billed her for rent already paid to the previous manager. Then she did something unexpected. She turned to the landlord's representative. "Do you have records showing that the prior management company didn't forward payment records to your office?" He shifted. We assumed they did." "That's not an answer," she said gently but firmly. Under city housing regulations, the burden of accurate record transfer falls on the landlord when management changes, not the tenant. The judge's eyebrows lifted. He flipped open a thick binder on his bench, his own copy of local ordinances, and found the section she'd cited. He read it silently, then looked up. "She's right," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The landlord's rep stammered, "Your Honor, there may have been an internal oversight. An oversight that led to threatening a tenant with eviction over money she already paid?" The judge cut in, his tone sharper now. The room fell still. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She just stood there, grounded in the truth she'd carried like a stone in her pocket for months. Then the judge did something unusual. He asked her a question, not to trap her, but to understand. "If you're not a lawyer," he said, "why go to such lengths? Why not just hire someone?" She paused. This was the part she hadn't rehearsed because it wasn't about law. It was about life. "Because I couldn't afford one," she said quietly, "and because last time I trusted the system to protect me. I lost custody of my child for 6 weeks. Not because I was unfit, because I missed a court date I never got notice of. The paperwork got lost. No one called. No one checked. I learned then that if I wanted to keep my family safe, I had to learn how to speak the language of this place." Her voice didn't break, but her eyes glistened. Not with tears of sadness, but with the weight of hard-won clarity. The judge looked down. For the first time all morning he seemed human. Then, as if testing her, he said, "All right, suppose I agree the billing was in error. What remedy are you seeking?" "I'm not asking for money," she said. "I'm asking for the eviction filing to be dismissed with prejudice so it doesn't follow me to future rentals. And I'd like a written confirmation that my account is current and in good standing. Reasonable, precise, legally sound." The landlord's rep opened his mouth to object, but the judge held up a hand. "You've had months to verify your records. You brought an unfounded case to court. That has consequences," he turned back to her. "You've presented your case clearly and with supporting documentation. I'm inclined to rule in your favor." Relief washed over her, but she didn't let it show. "Not yet." Then, just as the gavel was about to fall, she added one last thing. "Your Honor, before you rule, I'd like to ask something." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead. Could you please make it part of the record that self-represented litigants deserve the same respect as attorneys? Not because we're the same, but because the law belongs to all of us." The courtroom went utterly silent. The judge stared at her. Not with annoyance, but with something closer to awe. He'd spent years moving cases along like assembly line work, rarely seeing the people behind the files. But here was someone who hadn't just shown up, she'd prepared. She'd studied. She'd persisted. And she'd done it not for glory, but for survival. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. "Noted." He turned to the clerk. "Dismiss the eviction action with prejudice. Order the landlord to issue a letter of good standing within 5 business days. And mark the file. Defendant's submissions were thorough, timely, and legally grounded." Then, as if remembering his earlier tone, he looked at her and said, "You conducted yourself with dignity and competence today. That doesn't go unnoticed." She gave a small nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." As she gathered her papers, hands no longer shaking, a young woman in the back row, also there for a housing issue, caught her eye and gave a quiet, hopeful smile. She returned it. Outside, the sun was higher now, warming the courthouse steps. She didn't run or cheer. She just walked slowly to the bus stop, folder under her arm, mind already turning to what came next. Picking up her child from school, making dinner, maybe reading one more chapter of that civil procedure book she kept by her bed. But something had changed, not just in her case, but in the quiet understanding that knowledge, when paired with courage, can level the steepest ground. And somewhere inside the courthouse, a judge sat at his desk a little longer than usual, staring at the file on his desk, wondering how many other people like her had walked through those doors, unseen, unheard until today. The victory in court didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like breathing again after holding your breath for months. She walked out of the courthouse with her folder tucked under her arm, the late afternoon sun warm on her face. There was no crowd waiting, no reporters shouting questions. Just the hum of city traffic and the distant laughter of kids leaving school. She checked her phone. 2 missed calls from her child's after-school program. She smiled and dialed back, her voice softening instantly. "Hey, sweetie. Yeah, I'm on my way." But even as she spoke, her mind drifted back, not to the courtroom, but further, to the nights that led her there. It hadn't started with housing disputes or legal codes. It started with silence, the kind that follows a slammed door or a missed phone call. Years ago, she'd been younger, newer to motherhood, trusting that the system would catch her if she stumbled. She'd shown up to every appointment, filled out every form, followed every rule she knew. But when a simple clerical error caused a missed court date in a custody matter, no one reached out. No warning, no second chance. One day she was tucking her child in. The next, a social worker was at her door with papers she barely understood. She'd stood in that courtroom then too, confused, scared, voice trembling. She didn't know terms like default judgment or motion to vacate. She just knew her child was being kept from her and no one seemed to care why. The judge that day had barely looked up. "You failed to appear," he'd said, as if that explained everything. And just like that, 6 weeks slipped away. 6 weeks of bedtime stories missed, scraped knees unseen, first steps already taken by the time she got back in the room. That silence broke something in her. Not her spirit, but her trust. She realized then that fairness wasn't automatic. It had to be claimed. And to claim it, you had to speak the language of those who held the gavels and the pens, so she started learning. It began with library books checked out under her child's name because she'd maxed out her own limit. She read tenant rights guides, family law summaries, even basic civil procedure manuals, dry as dust but full of power if you knew how to use them. She watched free online lectures from law schools, pausing and rewinding until the concept stuck. She joined online forums where people shared templates for motions and tips for courtroom etiquette. She practiced speaking slowly, clearly without apology. At night, after her child fell asleep, she'd sit at the kitchen table with a legal pad, writing out arguments like letters to a future version of herself, the one who wouldn't be ignored. She never wanted to be a lawyer. She just wanted to be heard, and that's what brought her back to court this time, not anger but preparation. She'd seen the eviction notice and felt that old panic rise, but instead of folding, she opened her notebook. She gathered every email, every receipt, every piece of paper that told the truth. She didn't wait for someone to save her. She became her own advocate. Now, riding the bus home, she thought about the judge's face when she cited the housing code. Not disbelief, though there was that, but something deeper. The dawning realization that the person standing before him wasn't what he'd assumed. He'd expected emotion. He got evidence. He'd expected confusion. He got clarity. She didn't blame him, not really. She'd made assumptions too, about lawyers, about judges, about who belonged in a courtroom. But experience had taught her that labels lie. A single mother can know the law. A tired woman in worn shoes can stand firm. A person with no title can still speak truth with precision. When she got home, her child ran to the door, backpack bouncing, eyes bright. "Did you win?" She knelt down, brushing hair from their forehead. "We did. Because you knew what to say?" "Because I knew what was true," she corrected gently. "And I wasn't afraid to say it." Later, as they ate dinner, simple pasta with butter and peas, her child asked, "Can I learn that stuff too?" She paused, fork halfway to her mouth. "Why?" "So I can help people like you helped yourself." Her throat tightened. This was why she'd done it. Not just to keep a roof overhead, but to show that dignity isn't given. It's claimed. And it can be taught. That night after bedtime, she sat at the table again. But this time, she wasn't studying for a case. She was writing something new. A list of local resources for tenants simplified into plain language. She thought about the young woman who'd smiled at her in the courtroom gallery. How many others were sitting in those hard benches, scared and unsure, thinking they had no chance. She opened her laptop and started drafting a one-page guide. What to do if you get an eviction notice. No legalese. Just clear steps. Keep every receipt, write down every conversation, know your rights, show up prepared. She didn't plan to become famous. Didn't want interviews or headlines. But if one person read her guide and felt a little less alone, it would be worth it. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, the judge sat in his chambers long after closing time. He'd pulled her file again, not because he needed to, but because something about it stayed with him. He flipped through her submissions, neatly organized, numbered, referenced. He compared them to filings from licensed attorneys that week. Hers were clearer. He thought about his own training, Years of law school, expensive textbooks, mentors who handed him opportunities on silver platters. And here was someone who'd built her knowledge from scraps and stubborn hope, all while working 2 jobs and raising a child alone. He picked up the phone and called the court's community outreach coordinator. "We need to do better," he said. "We need to make sure people know they can prepare, that they're not just bodies moving through a system." He didn't mention her by name, but her presence lingered in the room like a quiet revolution. Days passed. Life returned to its rhythm. Laundry, groceries, school drop-offs. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Neighbors who used to glance away now stopped to talk. A woman from her building asked for help reading a lease. She sat with her at the kitchen table, just like she'd done for herself, pointing out clauses and red flags. She wasn't a lawyer, but she was becoming something else, a bridge. And bridges, she realized, don't shout. They just hold steady so others can cross. No one filmed her that week, no viral clips. But in small, quiet ways, her victory rippled outward. Not as a spectacle, but as an invitation. You can learn this too. You belong here too. And that, more than any ruling, was the real win. A week after the hearing, a short video clip began circulating online. It wasn't professionally shot. Just a shaky phone recording from someone seated in the back row of the courtroom. The audio was muffled in parts but clear enough to hear her voice, calm, steady, citing the housing code by number. And then the judge's stunned pause. The clip ended right after he said, "She's right," and the screen went dark. It wasn't posted with fanfare. No dramatic music, no flashy captions, just a title. "Single Mom Defends Herself in Court." Judge didn't see it coming. Within days, it had been shared thousands of times, not because it was sensational, but because it felt real. People saw themselves in her, the tired eyes, the worn clothes, the quiet strength. Comments poured in. "This gave me hope. I'm going to court next month. This helps. Why don't they teach this in school?" She didn't post it. Didn't even know it existed until a neighbor showed it to her on their phone while waiting for the bus. She watched it once, then handed the phone back. "That's not the whole story," she said softly. But the internet doesn't wait for permission. News outlets picked it up. Local radio called. A legal nonprofit reached out, asking if she'd speak at a community event. She declined most offers, not out of fear but focus. She wasn't trying to become a symbol. She was trying to live her life and help others do the same. Still, the attention had consequences. Good ones mostly. The landlord's company issued a formal apology and updated their tenant communication policy. The City Housing Authority announced a new workshop series on tenant rights, and after a quiet recommendation from someone inside the courthouse, asked her to help design the curriculum. She agreed, but only if it stayed practical. No jargon, no fluff. Just what people needed to know. How to read a lease, how to document repairs, how to respond to an eviction notice. She insisted the sessions be held in the evening, near bus lines with childcare provided. If it's not accessible, she told the organizer, it's not justice. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, things were changing too. Quietly, but surely. The same judge who'd once rolled his eyes at self-represented litigants now paused before speaking. He started asking clerks to double-check if defendants had access to legal aid resources. He even approved a pilot program, a self-help corner in the courthouse lobby with sample forms, plain language guides, and a volunteer paralegal available twice a week. He never admitted he was wrong, not publicly. But action spoke louder. One afternoon, he walked past the new self-help table and saw a young man nervously flipping through a packet on small claims court. The judge stopped, cleared his throat, and said, "Start with the checklist on page 3. It'll save you time." Then he kept walking as if it were nothing. But the man's shoulders relaxed. Someone had seen him. Back in her apartment, she kept working. She finished the tenant guide and printed 20 copies at the library. She left them at the community center, the food pantry, even taped one to the bulletin board at the laundromat. Each copy had a handwritten note at the bottom. You don't need a lawyer to know your rights, but you do need to know them. Her child started bringing friends home after school, and she'd overhear them talking in hushed tones about your mom who beat the judge. She'd smile and bring out cookies, never correcting them, because in their eyes she wasn't just a parent. She was proof that ordinary people could stand up and be heard. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope. No return address. Inside was a formal notice from the State Judicial Conduct Commission. It wasn't for her. It was about the judge. Someone, likely another court employee or a regular observer, had filed a complaint about his behavior during her hearing. Not the ruling, but the tone. The mockery. The assumption that she couldn't possibly know what she was talking about. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. She didn't want him punished. She wanted him changed, and from what she'd heard from clerks, from neighbors who worked in city offices, it seemed he was. A few days later, she received an unexpected visitor. Not a reporter, not a lawyer, just a woman. Older, with tired eyes and a stack of papers in her hands. She stood at the door, hesitant. "I saw the video," she said. "I've got a custody hearing next week. I can't afford a lawyer. I don't know where to start." Without a word, she stepped aside and gestured to the kitchen table. "Sit down. Let's look at your papers." For 2 hours, they went through every document. She showed the woman how to organize her evidence, how to write a simple statement, how to address the judge respectfully but firmly. She didn't promise victory, only preparation. As the woman left, tears in her eyes, she turned and said, "You're an angel." "No," she replied gently. "I'm just someone who learned the hard way that silence costs more than speaking up." That night, she lay awake longer than usual, not worrying but thinking, about how broken systems don't fix themselves, about how change often starts not with a shout, but with a single person refusing to be erased. She thought about the judge, the landlord, the woman at her door, all connected now, not by conflict, but by a shared moment of reckoning. The next morning, she got a call from the courthouse. Not about her case, about a new idea. Would she be willing to co-lead a monthly legal literacy night? Open to anyone, free, held in the community room downstairs. She said yes. Not because she wanted the spotlight, but because she remembered what it felt like to walk into that courtroom alone, heart pounding, convinced she didn't belong. If she could make one person feel a little less afraid, a little more ready, it would be worth every late night, every library trip, every moment of doubt. The world wouldn't change overnight. But in small rooms, over kitchen tables and courthouse desks, something was shifting. Not power, but access. Not fame, but fairness, and that was enough. Months passed. The seasons turned. The courthouse steps saw rain, then sun, then the first crisp bite of autumn. Life settled into a new rhythm, not perfect, but steadier. The eviction threat was gone. The landlord sent the letter of good standing just as ordered. And the small apartment, once shadowed by worry, now felt like a true home again. She still worked long hours, early shifts at the diner, evenings cleaning offices. But something had shifted inside her. She no longer carried the weight of helplessness. Instead, she moved with a quiet certainty, the kind that comes not from winning, but from knowing you can stand your ground. The legal literacy nights at the courthouse became a regular thing. Every third Thursday, the community room filled with people, grandparents fighting unfair utility bills, young renters confused by lease terms, parents navigating school disputes. She didn't lecture. She listened. Then she'd pull out a sample form, walk through it line by line and say, "This is how you protect yourself." No jargon. No judgment. Just clear, practical help. She never called herself a teacher, but that's what she became. One evening, a teenager showed up with her younger brother in tow. Their mom was in the hospital, and their landlord was threatening to change the locks. The girl's hands shook as she held the notice. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. She sat with them for over an hour, helping them draft a response, showing them where to file it, even walking them to the clerk's office to make sure it was stamped correctly. As they left, the girl hugged her, briefly, fiercely, and said, "You're like a real-life superhero." She smiled. Superheroes don't exist, but people who show up for each other do. Back home that night, she found her own child reading one of her legal notebooks. "Are you going to be a lawyer?" They asked. "Maybe not," she said, sitting beside them. "But I want to make sure you never have to be afraid of a courtroom. Knowledge isn't just for lawyers. It's for anyone who wants to be treated fairly." Her child nodded, then pointed to a highlighted line. "This part says everyone deserves a fair hearing, even if they're poor. Especially if they're poor," she corrected gently. Meanwhile, the judge had changed in ways no one announced, but everyone noticed. He still ran a tight courtroom, but his tone was different. Less impatient, more patient. He started pausing when self-represented litigants spoke, really listening. Once, when a man fumbled through his papers, the judge didn't sigh or interrupt. He simply said, "Take your time. We'll wait." Court staff whispered that he'd taken a training course on implicit bias, that he'd met with legal aid groups, that he'd even apologized to her in a quiet letter left with the court clerk. It wasn't public. Didn't need to be. It said only, "Thank you for reminding me why this job matters." She kept the letter in the same drawer as the judicial conduct notice. Not as trophies, but as reminders. People can grow. Systems can bend, and sometimes one moment of courage opens a door for many. The video clip that had gone viral months earlier had long faded from trending pages. But its impact lingered, not in headlines, but in small acts.
A neighbor helped another fill out a housing complaint.
A bus driver mentioned the legal nights to a passenger. A school counselor kept copies of her tenant guide in her office. She never monetized her story. Turned down podcast interviews, book deals, even a local TV feature. "This isn't about me," she'd say. "It's about making sure no one feels as alone as I did." Instead, she poured her energy into something quieter, a free monthly workshop at the public library. She called it Know Your Rights 101. Attendance grew. People brought friends. Some came just to sit and listen, too nervous to speak. She made space for that too. One rainy afternoon, as she was packing up after a session, an older man approached. He'd been coming for weeks, always sitting in the back, never saying a word. Today, he handed her a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a $20 bill. "I can't afford much," he said, voice rough, "but I want to help keep this going." She tried to give the money back, but he shook his head. "You gave me my dignity back. Let me give something too." She used the $20 to buy notebooks for the next workshop, wrote each participant's name on the cover in neat script. Small things, human things. At home, life remained ordinary in the best way. Homework at the kitchen table, pancakes on Sundays, walks to the park. But now, when her child asked hard questions about fairness, about power, about why some people get treated differently, she had answers that weren't just hopeful, but honest. Change doesn't come from waiting, she'd say. It comes from doing what's right even when no one's watching. One evening, as she tucked her child into bed, they asked, "Do you think the judge really changed?" She thought for a moment. I think he remembered something he'd forgotten, that the law isn't just rules on paper. It's about people, and people deserve to be seen. The next day, she received an invitation, not from a news station or a law firm, but from the city council. They were updating tenant protection laws and wanted community input. Would she serve on the advisory committee? She said yes. Not for recognition, but because she knew what it felt like to fall through the cracks, and if she could help patch even one, it would matter. Years later, someone might look back and call her a pioneer. But in the moment, she was just a parent, a neighbor, a person who refused to stay silent. Her legacy wouldn't be a headline or a courtroom victory. It would be the woman who showed up at the legal night with her child in tow, the teenager who filed her first motion alone, the judge who learned to listen. On a quiet Sunday morning, she sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and a new legal manual, this one on education rights. Her child played nearby, building a tower of blocks. Outside, the world kept turning, full of injustice and beauty, broken systems and quiet courage. She turned a page, underlined a sentence, and smiled. Not because she had all the answers, but because she knew the most powerful thing anyone can do is try to learn them, and then share what they've learned. And in that simple act, dignity lives.